Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to today's Friday Reflections. Jummah Mubarak. Up until today, I've generally read from books like the Quran or from the books of sheikhs or the Islamic sources. But I, in fact, read very widely. And I highly recommend that people who are watching this to read widely themselves. Knowledge is an ocean. And it's not just an ocean that's restricted to Muslims. There are many great writers and thinkers who we benefit from reading from. Today I'm going to read from one who not only inspired Western thinkers, but inspired a lot of Muslim thinkers over the centuries. I'm reading from Plato's Republic. And I'm going to read the Allegory of the Cave. Probably some of you already know it, or you've read it before, or you've watched some YouTube video made on it. But it's something which, it's just absolutely brilliant what Plato describes here. And it's a very, very good way of understanding the process of learning and enlightenment. So, without further ado, I think I will get on with it. Next, I said, here's a situation which you can use as an analogy for the human condition, for our education or lack of it. Imagine people living in a cavernous cell down under the ground, at the far end of a cave, a long way off. There's an entrance open to the outside world. They've been there since childhood, with their legs and necks tied up in a way which keeps them in one place and allows them to look only straight ahead, but not to turn their heads. There's a firelight burning a little way further up the cave behind them, and up the slope between the fire and the prisoners there's a road, besides which you should imagine a low wall has been built, like the partition which conjurers place between themselves and their audience, and above which they show their tricks. All right, he said. Imagine also there are people on the other side of this wall who are carrying all sorts of artifacts. These artifacts, human statuettes and animal models carved in wood and stone, and all kinds of materials stuck out over the wall. And as you'd expect, some of these people talk as they carry these objects along while others are silent. This is a strange picture you're painting, he said, with strange prisoners. They're no different from us, I said. I mean, in the first place, do you think they'd see anything of themselves and one another except the shadows cast by the fire on the wall directly opposite them? Of course not, he said. They're forced to spend their lives without moving their heads. And what about the objects which are being carried along? Won't they only see the shadows as well? Naturally. Now, suppose they were able to talk to one another. Don't you think they'd assume that their words applied to what they saw passing by in front of them? They couldn't think otherwise. And what if sound echoed off the prison wall opposite them? When any of the passers-by spoke, don't you think that they'd be bound to assume that the sound came from the passing shadow? I'm absolutely certain of it. All in all, then, the shadows of the artifacts would constitute the only reality people in that situation could recognize. Yeah, that's absolutely inevitable. What do you think would happen then, I asked, if they were set free from their bonds and cured of their inanity? What would it be like if they found that happening to them? Imagine that one of them has been set free and is suddenly made to stand up, to turn his head and walk, and to look towards the firelight. It hurts him to do all this, and he's too dazzled to be capable of making out the objects whose shadows he'd formerly been looking at. And suppose someone tells him that what he's been seeing all this time has no substance, that he's now closer to reality and is seeing more accurately because of the greater reality of the things in front of him. What do you imagine his reaction would be? And what do you think he'd say if he were shown any of the passing objects and had to respond to being asked what they were? Don't you think he'd be bewildered? And would you think there was more reality in what he'd been seen before than what he was being shown now? Far more. And if he were forced to look at the actual firelight, don't you think it would hurt his eyes? Don't you think he'd turn away and run back to the things he could make out? And would it take the truth of the matter to be of those things are clearer than what he was being shown? Yes, he agreed. And imagine him being dragged forcibly away from there up the rough, steep slope. I went on, without being released until he's been pulled out into the sunlight. Wouldn't this treatment cause him pain and distress? And once he's reached the sunlight, he wouldn't be able to see a single one of the things which are currently taken to be real, would he? Because his eyes would be overwhelmed by the sun's beams. No, he wouldn't, he answered. Not straight away. He wouldn't be able to see the things up on the surface of the earth, I suppose, until he got used to the situation. At first, it would be shadows that he could most easily make out. Then he'd move on to the reflections of people, and so on in water. And later, he'd be able to see the actual things themselves. Next, he'd feast his eyes on the heavenly bodies and the heavens themselves, which would be easier at night. He'd look at the light of the stars and the moon, rather than the sun and sunlight during the day. Of course. And at last, I imagine he'd be able to discern and feast his eyes on the sun. Not the displaced image of the sun in water or elsewhere, but the sun on its own in its proper place. Yes, he'd inevitably come to that, he said. After that, he'd start to think about the sun, and he'd deduce that it was the source of the seasons and the yearly cycle, that the whole of the visible realm is its domain, and that in a sense everything which he and his peers used to see is its responsibility. Yes, that would obviously be the next point he'd come to, he agreed. Now, if he recalled the cell where he'd originally lived, and what passed for knowledge there, and his former fellow prisoners, don't you think he'd feel happy about his own altered circumstances, and sorry for them? Definitely. Suppose that the prisoners used to assign prestige and credit to one another, in the sense that they rewarded speed at recognizing the shadows as they passed, and the ability to remember which ones normally come earlier and later, and at the same time as which other ones, and expertise at using this as a basis for guessing which ones would arrive next. Do you think our former prisoner would covet these honours and would envy the people who had status and power there? Or would he much prefer, as Homer describes it, being a slave labouring for someone else, someone without property, and would put up with anything at all, in fact, rather than share their beliefs and life? Yes, I think he would go through anything rather than live that way, he said. Here's something else I'd like your opinion about. If he went back underground and sat down there again in the same spot, wouldn't the sudden transition from sunlight mean that his eyes would be overwhelmed by darkness? Certainly, he replied. Now, the process of adjustment would be quite long this time, and suppose that his eyes had settled down, and while he wasn't seeing well, he had once again to compete against these same old prisoners at identifying no shadows. Wouldn't he make a fool of himself? Wouldn't they say that he'd come back from his upward journey with his eyes ruined? and that it wasn't even worth trying to go up there. And wouldn't they, if they could, grab hold of anyone who tried to set him free and take him up there and kill him? They certainly would, he said. Well, my dear Glaucon, you should certainly apply this allegory as a whole to what we were talking about before. The region which is accessible to sight should be equated with the prison cell, and the firelight there with the light of the sun. If you think of the upward journey and the sight of the things upon the surface of the earth as the mind's ascent to the intelligible realm, you won't be wrong. At least I don't think you'd be wrong. And it's my impression that you would want to hear. Only God knows if it's actually true, however. Anyway, it's my opinion that the last thing to be seen, and it isn't easy to see either, in the realm of knowledge is goodness. And the sight of the character of goodness leads one to deduce that it is responsible for everything that is right and fine, whatever the circumstances, and that in the visible realm it is a progenitor of light and a source of light, an intelligible realm it is the source and provider of truth and knowledge, and also think that the sight of it is a prerequisite for intelligent conduct, either of one's own private affairs or of their public business. There's a bit more to this, but I'm not going to read any more from that. I think we've got the summary of it. And I was fascinated when I first read Plato's Allegory of the Cave some years ago now, because isn't this the situation today of virtually everybody? And we even have things that we have around us that, so many people, they just get their view of the world from their television or from certain media channels, maybe on the internet these days. And they think that's reality. Whenever you get drawn into any of these perspectives too deeply, remember Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And think, am I really seeing reality? Or am I just seeing those shadows on the wall that Plato talked about a very long time ago? More often than not, we'll probably find we're talking about shadows on a wall. And this is something to always be aware of, so we don't get too full of ourselves and we don't get too caught up in things. As Allah advises in the Quran that whenever we hear something, we should verify it and see if it's true or not. And also Allah says in the Quran that the one who knows is not the same as the one who doesn't know. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it's there. So keep this in mind. May Allah bless you all. Hope you find this interesting and useful. And whatever you're going through, make things easier for you. Have a lovely weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.